Everybody ready? Cameras, mutes.
I think history is a lot more effective if you argue by implication. If you tell somebody they're just wrong, they're probably not going to listen to your next sentence. And so, to me, the goal is here are moments in history that have felt like the one we're in, and here's how we got out of them. And to me, the American story is the story of more generously applying what Jefferson meant when he wrote that all men are created equal. We don't build monuments to people who limit that definition. We don't commemorate holidays for people who decided to constrict access to the American mainstream. We celebrate, rightly, people who broaden the definition, who open doors, who open their arms. And that sounds partisan today, which tells us more about ourselves than anybody else, but it's not partisan. It's simply, I think, a clinical reading of the very human mess of history. The American story is full of violence and oppression, but it's also full of peace and liberation. All history comes out of conflict, whether it's racial or class or economic or political, tribal. That's inevitable. We live in a fallen world. We don't live in a perfect world. We don't live in a place where people come together and say, how can we make things better because that's the right thing to do? We live in a world where there are clashes of interests, there are winners and there are losers, and the moments that speak to us most are not the ones that feel Olympian and distant, but which feel messy, complicated, contingent, close run. We would think, for instance, that the Civil War should have been the beginning of a great new era, right? 750,000 Americans die, abolition is achieved, the 13th and 14th and 15th Amendments are passed. This is the beginning of a new modern era. But 5 minutes after Appomattox, 5 minutes after Lee's surrender, the reaction sets in. And that's the story of the country, is a couple of steps forward, step or two back. You just hope that by the time all the steps are counted, we're a few more ahead than we are back. We live in a world that is sinful and disappointing, and a world in which tragedy is far more often the state of things than a kind of comic conclusion. There's a reason Shakespeare's tragedies are performed more often, really, than his comedies, because I think they speak to us more. We're all more familiar with heartbreak than we are with heart fulfillment, and that's the nature of reality. The Constitution was written for moments like this. It was written with an understanding that we are frail and fallen and given to appetite and ambition, and that we have to, as the Federalist Papers said, have to have ambition to counteract ambition. If we don't look the world in the eye, if we don't take account of our own tendency to do the wrong thing, then the thinking we do to try to set up our public affairs won't be particularly effective, because people are going to do what they want to do. The greatness of America, in many ways, lies in the fact that we've created a system where the founders assumed we would do the wrong thing most of the time. We have not disappointed them. Winston Churchill once said, you can always count on the Americans to do the right thing once they've exhausted every other possibility, and that's what we do. And so I very much have a theological understanding of the nature of people and the nature of the country, which is in fact the same. A nation is only the fullest expression of the individual dispositions of heart and mind of all of us. And if we can get to doing the right thing 51% of the time in a given day as people, that's a hell of a good day. I don't make it very much. And the country's the same way, because the country is the sum of its parts. I can see why people would think that a message from a boringly heterosexual white Southern man to relax, it's all going to be fine, would be annoying, would be off-putting. I've never been oppressed. I am part of a gender and a class that has had things work out most of the time. But if people like me don't speak up, it seems to me that's unilaterally disarming in the struggle. To me, the message of hope is rooted in history. It's not coming out of a vision, some sort of ethereal vision of, I would like the world to be this way. It's based on how the world has been. The experiment, which was based on this understanding that people were going to get things wrong more often than they get them right, has in fact been worth protecting and perpetuating. And I think I'm right. I really do, because if you had grabbed an American in 1866 and said, how are things going? Well, if you were a formerly enslaved person in the American South, things weren't going very well. You had the Ku Klux Klan on the march. You had the South trying to resist the implications of the verdict of the Civil War. If you were an Irish immigrant in New England and you were being told you didn't need to apply for a job because we don't hire Irish Catholics because we think Roman Catholicism is what people today would call Sharia law. If you were an Asian immigrant in California and you had a United States senator in Washington say that we were worried that there was going to be a yellow Asiatic empire from California to the Rockies, that's not a great moment. Nobody ever sat around at a moment in the past and said, wow, everything is perfect. If only everything could stay exactly this way. We're always questing. We're always wanting more. And sometimes you do that from a position of power. Sometimes you do it from a position of powerlessness. We all know what the American ideal is. It's fair play, it's liberty under law, it's equal opportunity, it's what Lincoln called a fair chance for your industry, intelligence, and enterprise. We can all agree on that. If you wake people up in the middle of the night and say, what's the ideal of America? That's what they'll say. We're equal, we're home, land of the free, home of the brave. But the question becomes, how do you make the ideal real? And that's why I talk about the soul of the country, because in Hebrew and in Greek, soul means breath or life. The pagan world understood that there was an essence to who we were. And my view is that the soul of the country, you have your better angels on one side, and you have your worst instincts on the other. And every moment, every era is shaped by the battle between those two forces. In Reconstruction, all the forces that continue to shape us, anxiety about race, anxiety about class, anxiety about power, shaped and suffused the era. So you come out of 1865, we think that it's a new world. We think that we've adjudicated the great question that had bedeviled the American founding, which is the role of slavery and enslavement in American life. And we find that actually there's still an enormous amount of racial animus that finds expression in law and in custom. People were not in fact willing to apply the entire meaning of the Declaration to everybody, even though we just fought a war over that question. Whether it's states' rights or telling the government to stay out of your business or all those touch points that continue to shape our politics were on vivid display from 1866 really through the 1920s. You had a Supreme Court rule in Plessy versus Ferguson, the separate but equal was a constitutional principle. You had the Ku Klux Klan rioting and committing vigilante violence. You had an American president, Andrew Johnson, who was unstable, egotistical, appealed to the worst in us and not the best. Any of this sound familiar? You know, as Mark Twain is alleged to have said, history doesn't repeat itself, but it does rhyme. All of those forces are in play in America in the wake of the Civil War. The white resistance to the implications of the Civil War, that in fact the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments were the law of the land. We had decided that Jefferson's assertion that all men were created equal applied in fact to all men regardless of color. There was immediate pushback on that. In 1865, a Confederate journalist named Edward Alfred Pollard wrote a book called The Lost Cause, in which he defined the cause of white supremacy as the new abiding concern of the southern states. So we've gone from slavery to supremacy. It's a difference of degree, but it's not a difference of kind. It was Palm Sunday, 1865, April 1865. General Lee is surrendering the Army of Northern Virginia to Ulysses S. Grant. They meet at Wilmer McLean's house at Appomattox Courthouse, a village in Virginia. And if history were a fairy tale, this would be the moment at which we all lived happily ever after. the Army of Rebellion, the secessionist movement that had cost so much blood, so much toil, so much treasure, was ending peaceably. Lee goes and with dignity surrenders. Grant goes and with dignity and grace accepts the surrender. And that should be, if this were a movie, the moment at which then flowers spring and the sun comes out and the music swells. But it didn't. It didn't. White supremacy replaced slavery as the consuming concern of white Southerners. Lee did not leave Appomattox to return to a South that was willing to accept the implications of the defeat. He returned to a South that wanted to keep fighting under a different flag, although sometimes the same flag, for a slightly different cause. But the essence was the same. The essence was, no, we don't think that all men are created equal. We don't think that. We say we do, but in point of fact, we're not going to act that way. And we're going to set up laws, we're going to set up governments in the southern states, a huge part of the country, that is going to put segregation and racially based discrimination in law and custom. We're not interested in a new birth of freedom, as Lincoln put it. What we're interested in is preserving our way of life as best we can since we lost. That's the Southern view. That view continues to shape the understandings of an enormous number of folks 150 years on. The Lost Cause was an attempt by the white South to give some meaning to their defeat, some explanation of their defeat, and then to give the future a shape as well. And so suddenly the South didn't lose because they were wrong. The South, in this view, lost because they were outgunned and outmanned, and the pure brute strength of the North is what led to the Southern defeat. It wasn't a moral failing, it was a material one. And if it's not a moral failing, then you have the excuse to continue to try to live under that system of law and custom. The Lost Cause was the origin myth, in many ways, of the 20th century South, and to some extent the 21st century South. The people who in the 1960s were resisting the implications of the Supreme Court decision about school integration, the people in the 1960s who were resisting the federal government's attempts to undo Jim Crow, were all acting as if they were the last stand, the last battalion in the Civil War. That in fact the Civil War had not ended at Appomattox. The Civil War was simply taking a different form and continuing to unfold. The task that was before Grant and before Lincoln and then before Andrew Johnson is almost unimaginable in its complexity, because as much as we want the North to be, as Robert Penn Warren said, to be a virtuous region, it was driven by racial questions as well. It was driven by and shaped by a sense of racism. If the cause was union, then what Grant was trying to do was create terms that would bring the Union back together as quickly and seamlessly as possible. Where things got complicated real fast was the North was in many ways shaped by racism, as was the South, and they were attempting a social revolution on the back of a military victory, which is very hard to do. And what Grant knew and what Lincoln knew was that the Union would have to endure and was to endure. And if it were going to do that, then we were neighbors again. And so to be harsh toward the South, to be punitive toward the South, would create more chaos in peacetime and a kind of quasi-military struggle that would continue after the full military struggle. You know, Harry Truman once said, "Heroes always know when to die." And Abraham Lincoln, in a weird way, knew when to die. It's impossible to know whether he would have made a better success of Reconstruction. My own bet is that he would have, because what you saw with Lincoln was someone who was self-evidently changing and growing as president. If you go back and read the first inaugural, he says, look, to the southern states, you have nothing to fear from me if you're a slaveholding state. But he got to emancipation. The last statements he made on Reconstruction were more conciliatory, but faced with a recalcitrant South, would he have conducted a policy that was ultimately more effective? Would it have been a policy that protected the civil liberties that had been so hard fought in the war? My own bet is yes, but it's a mystery of history. Andrew Johnson's conduct of Reconstruction in many ways was the last Southern battle of the Civil War. He was doing everything he could to reverse the verdict that had been reached on the battlefield. He vetoed civil rights bills. He opposed the 14th Amendment, which provided equal protection under law. He did everything he could to return the country as much as he could to an antebellum way of being. And he did so not least because he was a white Southerner. That was his constituency. He was not a Republican. He'd been put on the ticket in 1864 to balance out a wartime election ticket. Imagine if you had a Republican president who dies and then a Democratic president comes in and in our own terms starts passing Medicare for all and high tax rates after the Republican who'd won the election had run on an opposite platform. That's kind of where we were. See if any of this sounds familiar. Andrew Johnson was an unconventional American president who had come to ultimate power by an unconventional route. He did not have a natural political constituency in Washington, and he believed very much that he needed to govern for his narrow base of supporters and not for the country as a whole. There's a long time debate about who really won the Civil War. It's a little facetious. But the South got a really good deal out of the war. Perhaps the best way to put it is the North won the war, but the South won the peace. And it created a century or more of essentially an antebellum way of life in the South. Segregation replaced slavery. Separate but equal replaced human enslavement. But that was the way the world was going to be for well over 100 years. It's 100 years from Appomattox to the Voting Rights Act, almost exactly. The Voting Rights Act was proposed, and the great energy behind it came in March of 1965. Appomattox was April 1865. You had an entire century where the Southern vision of race relations was largely predominant over what you would have thought would have been the implications of the verdict of the war. You look at Charlottesville in 2017, neo-Nazis, Klansmen marching around. That is precisely, at least in terms of the Klansmen, what the world looked like in 1866-67. You have people who are resisting the verdict, resisting the tide of history in order to stand up for a racially defined, divisive way of life. And the fact that in the 21st century, people calling themselves Klansmen are in Charlottesville, Virginia, the home of Robert E. Lee, not far from Appomattox, basically fighting for an antebellum vision of the world is a remarkable thing. But it's not all that remarkable if you know American history. And if you know that 5 minutes after Appomattox, people were trying to figure out, all right, we lost the big one, how can we win the smaller ones? Confederate journalist, writer Edward Alfred Pollard writes this book called The Lost Cause. He writes it in 1865. It's published in January of 1866, so not even a year after Appomattox, saying that we now have to embrace this new war for white supremacy, He followed it up with another book 2 years later. He talked about a war of ideas. He talked about the fact that we meaning the white South, had to resist the encroachments of a consolidated government, which is what they would have called big government. He totally framed this idea of an acceptable resistance to the full implications of what the Civil War, after emancipation and after Gettysburg, had been about. Lincoln said this is about a new birth of freedom. This is about the enslaved people being forever free. Pollard and others say, no, we don't accept that. What we're going to do is fight a rearguard action, decade to decade to decade, saying that our way of life, a way of life based on skin color and exclusion, is going to carry the day no matter what happened at Antietam or Gettysburg or Appomattox. The Lost Cause was very much about big government versus states' rights. It was very much about Washington versus the rest of us. It was very much about the feds are trying to tell us what to do. That argument, which has shaped us in every ensuing decade, it has some origins way, way back. Jefferson versus Hamilton was to some extent about this in the early republic. But for our purposes, for the modern world, the reaction after the Civil War of the white Southerners trying to say, federal troops need to get out of here, we don't want Reconstruction forces, we want to govern our own affairs, all goes back to this idea that the war was lost, but we could win the peace. The Lost Cause as an idea, and the book itself, caught fire and endured because it spoke to this deep longing on the part of a defeated people to both find meaning in the defeat and a way forward, but not a way forward in acquiescence to federal will, but a way forward in resistance to that will. There were many white Southerners who tried to argue that they were fighting for states' rights and not slavery. It's not an argument that holds up by any means, but the postbellum vision of a lost cause gave them a way forward, a way to think of the struggle in not just in racial terms, but as a whole political identity. The lost cause sanctifies the Southern vision of the world. It becomes a cause that was not defeated morally, but was defeated because they were outmanned, they were outgunned. But it let them say, you know what, we were right. In our essence, we were right. And white supremacy is a principle worth defending. I mean, the lost cause gave a defeated people both an explanation for why they'd lost. The industrial North in all its might had defeated us, but we were right. We were right. And they're hypocrites because they're racist too. And it enabled a bunch of white Southerners to justify their racism from decade to decade to decade. Confederate memorials come a bit later. There was no money to build Confederate monuments. Most of the monuments put up in the South in the wake of the war were Union monuments because they had won and they had money. The true end of Reconstruction, formally in the 1890s, tended to lead to a burst in the monuments. It's a fascinating story about how Confederate memory was formed. The war became more Virginia-centric than Tennessee or Alabama or Mississippi. General Lee became the saint. There was an attempt to make Lee the martyr, and Lee was an appealing figure for that role. General Lee became the sainted martyr who, if only he'd had the strength, the guns, the men and material that Grant had had, he would have carried the day. And by being a martyr, it suggested that Lee was right, but was unjustly defeated. And that meant that white Southerners who believed in the antebellum vision of racism, of a race-based world, were also right. The political and cultural salience of the white supremacy argument was that anyone who was white, rich or middling or poor, could unite against the blacks. And so as a political strategy, it enabled people of means to enlist those who might have different economic interests than people with means against a common enemy.